Okay, so am I audible? And is my whiteboard visible? Can someone please confirm? Okay, excellent. So let's begin. So we have been talking about the magnetic properties of different minerals and rocks, and we got introduced to a particular term called magnetic susceptibility. Magnetic susceptibility. And we said M is equals to KH, where M stands for magnetization, K stands for the susceptibility constant, and H is the external magnetic field. And based on the value of K, we have subdivided different minerals and rocks into few categories. They are largely three categories. So one we said are diamagnetic, paramagnetic, and ferromagnetic. So within ferromagnetic also we had looked into some classes. One of the things that we talked about in the last class that this susceptibility K. So let's just move these. This susceptibility K is anisotropic. So what does that mean? That K varies with direction. So for example, if I look at a simple crystal, okay, of any system, this is the structure of a crystal. And then we can define certain crystallographic axis, okay, C, A, and B. Okay. So these are my reference frames, right? These are my reference frames. So these are the coordinates that we are looking at. So let's bring that ABC separately here. Okay. And then we actually try to map the value of K in different directions, okay, in 3 dimensions. So if we do that, what we will find? We will find that the susceptibility essentially can be expressed by an ellipse. Okay? Susceptibility can be expressed by an ellipse, which will have three axes, of course, maximum axis, an intermediate axis, and the minimum axis. So let's call them as K1, K2, and K3. So if I ask you the what is the susceptibility of this particular mineral, okay, at room temperature, because we also emphasized that susceptibility does change with temperature, and that is something we explained in the last class. So if I ask you what is the susceptibility of this material, what I'm asking you is essentially is the mean susceptibility, okay? Or this is also called bulk susceptibility. And that is nothing but K1 square plus K2 square, okay, which we call as Km, or mean susceptibility or bulk susceptibility. It is the same thing. Okay. So, the although this anisotropy is not very large, it doesn't mean that, I mean, that K1, K2, K3 are extremely different from each other. They are not. Generally, it is a low field anisotropy, but nevertheless, it actually varies with direction. And then, if I the susceptibility that we have been using to categorize different minerals are essentially the bulk susceptibility. Now, this anisotropy of susceptibility is a very important uh, thing that is used for geological study. Okay, and that particular study we call as anisotropy of magnetic susceptibility study. So, anisotropy of magnetic susceptibility study, or in short form, it's called AMS. And AMS is, very widely used for geological applications. Okay, so how AMS is used, I'm going to give you an example, okay, to a case study, and then you will be able to understand how it is used for different geological purposes. Okay, so we are going to talk now about AMS briefly. Now, let's consider that from a volcano, or simply through a fissure, there's a fissure or a fracture on the earth, magma is coming out. A hot magma is coming out. And then when it comes to the surface, you know, it gets solidified and it forms the igneous rocks, be it granite, actually rhyolite, because we are looking at the volcanic variety of rock, be it a rhyolite or be it a basalt, depending on its composition, whether it is felsic or whether it is mafic. So when it is actually, the flow is getting arrested, once the flow is getting arrested, that means it is being chilled and it can no longer flow. Okay? What happens? The elongated minerals, okay, or the minerals which have shape anisotropy. Okay. Now you see, I have used here one term called shape anisotropy. So there is another term which we call as crystallographic anisotropy. We are not essentially considering that. Why? Because, for example, what is crystallographic anisotropy? Crystallographic anisotropy is nothing but the anisotropy between A, B, the difference between the A and B and C axis of the particular crystal. And shape anisotropy is essentially how the grain looks. Okay. Sometimes the crystallographic anisotropy and shape anisotropy can be the same, but in many cases it might not be. Okay. Say for example, I have a crystal. Okay. So if I ask you which is the longest direction, the longest direction is along its c-axis, right? Now suppose, so this is the anisotropy that defines A, B, and C, the difference between A, B, and C is my crystallographic anisotropy. Now if I break this crystal, suppose I am breaking this crystal like this, in three parts. So how the crystal will look like now? Crystals will look something like this, right? Because it is broken. Now, if I ask you, where is the shape anisotropy, which is with respect to the shape, which is the longest axis? Perhaps this is my longest axis. Okay? Which is not necessarily coinciding with the c-axis of the crystal. Okay? So we are referring to the shape anisotropy, which is important for our MS study, not the crystallographic anisotropy. So, for example, I have several elongated grains in this flow. So what will happen because of this flow due to traction, these elongated crystals, the ones which are anhedral, I hope you know the meaning of anhedral, euhedral, and subhedral by now. Anhedral means which doesn't have a specific shape or which are completely elongated, okay, which are not which doesn't look like a sphere or a circle. Okay? So those are my anhedral crystals, anhedral, highly crystal shape, which are elongated. They will essentially be aligned. Yeah. Once it is being quenched, they will be aligned according to the flow direction of the magma. Okay? They will be aligned. Meanwhile, what will also happen, because of the presence of the Earth's magnetic field at that time, it will acquire magnetization. So now while this process of quenching of the rock is happening, this will also acquire magnetization, okay, because some sort of H is working. Now, what people have discovered and why this happens is still under debate, and people are trying to investigate that the susceptibility ellipsoid, yeah, also aligns itself along its shape anisotropy. So what I will observe, that my anisotropy ellipsoids or the susceptibility ellipsoids will also align itself along the direction of the flow, that is the direction of the arrangement of the crystals. Okay, so that means the K1 will be directed along my direction of flow. Okay. Up to this, is this clear for you, everyone? Can someone just confirm what I just discussed? Is it clear?
Sir, why is the suscepticity ellipsoid and ellipsoid?
Susceptibility. Yeah. Why is?
Why is it elliptical in shape?
Because it is anisotropic.
Okay.
because A, B, K1, K2, and K3 are not equal. That's what I explained, na? That it is anisotropic. It is not isotropic. If it would have been isotropic, then it would have been spherical.
Spherical. Okay.
So if it is anisotropic, hence it is ellipsoidal. Okay. Anything else?
Yes, fine.
Anyone else? Any other question? So I hope this is clear. So the susceptibility ellipsoid will essentially follow the shape anisotropy of the particular elongated mineral grain. Okay, so that is what is happening now. Suppose you are in an area, okay, and you are looking at, for example, Deccan basalt, and then you are finding this big chunk of flow, very large flow, okay, and you want to understand how the flow went, whether the flow essentially, it's a three-dimensional body, of course, right? Whether the flow was from north to south, or whether the flow was northeast southwest, or the flow was east west. Yeah, you don't know. So that is something you want to understand. So you want to understand the flow direction just by looking at by using some techniques, by just looking at the field. You can actually talk about the direction of flow sometimes, but it is not always as simple as in the field. So it might not be possible always for you to detect the flow direction just by looking at an exposure. Okay? So then you have to actually understand, you know, uh, you have to find out some techniques by which you can talk about the flow direction. So one thing you can do, you can collect multiple samples from different areas, and then look at the thin section. So create thin section, of course, look at the thin section, and then find out which way my elongated minerals are oriented, right? That is something you can do. But remember, the flow direction is, of course, three-dimensional. So only taking one thin section from one plane is not enough. So you have to take thin sections from three planes. Okay. So one is like horizontal, one vertical, and another vertical, and then make three thin sections. The samples must be oriented samples. Okay, it must be oriented with respect to the geographical. So this will be oriented sample. They must be oriented with respect to the geographical reference frame. Okay, and then you can actually create three thin sections from each sample. Okay, three slides from each sample, and then look at them under microscope and see how my elongated mineral grains are actually oriented. Okay, and then you can do that for 100 different places. So 100 different places means you have to prepare 300 samples, right? So 300 thin sections. So you want to have a good statistical mean, because it will depend on statistics by and large. So maybe 300 multiplied by 3, that means 900 thin sections that you have to prepare. And preparing one thin section, I'm sure you will be exposed later on in your life how thin sections are prepared. It's a really, really tedious job, you know. And then, of course, the counting of each minerals orientation, elongated minerals orientation, it's a really, really cumbersome job. Okay, I want to do that in the physical way. Okay, but that job is extremely cumbersome. So to avoid that to avoid that exercise, what we can actually do, we can essentially take these oriented samples. Okay. So this is one chunk of such oriented sample. Okay. And then we will drill some beautiful cylinders out of it. Okay. 3 to 5 cylinders of fixed dimensions out of it. And then we will analyze them with respect to MS, anisotropy of magnetic susceptibility. So what each of these samples will give me the susceptibility ellipsoid. It will provide me the susceptibility ellipsoid. Okay. So do the AMS study and find out susceptibility ellipsoid. Yeah. And then use the susceptibility ellipsoid as a proxy for mineral elongation detection. Okay, but what is the advantage of this AMS technique? Is it is fairly quick. You don't have to really prepare thin sections out of it and do a very cumbersome job of measuring each mineral's orientation. Rather than that, you can actually take out samples, drill out core, and take it through an instrument called Kappa bridge. Yeah, and find out what is the susceptibility ellipsoid for each of these specimens, and then you can do your statistics to find out how the flow direction actually went, whether it is indeed northeast, southwest, or it was east-west, or it was north-south. Okay. So that is how AMS is used. So EMS is not only used to detect flow direction of magma. So what are the uses of AMS? Yeah. AT is used for detection of flow direction. Second, of course, detection of, so this is detection of magma flow, right? Magma flow detection of, if we do it in sedimentary rocks, undeformed sedimentary rocks, maybe alluvial sedimentary rocks, detection of fluid flow detection. That means, say for example, if I do it in a river sand, we can find out which way the river was actually flowing. Okay, because just by looking at a river sand, you might not always know whether it was flowing from north to south or south, east to west. You don't know. Okay, so you can find out the direction of fluid flow. I mean, sedimentary fluid. I mean, say for example, river or anything. Any fluid flow. It can be used to detect deformation as well. Okay. How is it used to detect deformation? We will study that in the structural geology class because you need to understand about deformation uh, before we understand the use of AMS for detecting deformation. But for the timing, I hope you could appreciate how magma flow is detected and how, for example, sedimentary flows are detected through anisotropy of magnetic susceptibility technique, where the susceptibility ellipsoid is used as a proxy to the shape anisotropy of the elongated mineral grain. Okay, because the elongated mineral grain will align itself along the direction of flow, so would be the susceptibility ellipsoid. So if you can detect the direction of susceptibility ellipsoid for number of samples, you can use it as a proxy for shape anisotropy, and so for your the direction of flow. Is that clear, everyone? Can someone tell me if it is clear? Or do you need any clarification around it? Okay, very good. All right. So now let's proceed with the lecture. Let me just draw something first, then I will explain what I'm drawing. So in the y-axis, I'm drawing K is my magnetic susceptibility. Okay, and here I'm plotting different rocks. Okay, so this is 10 to the power minus 5 SI units. Okay, SI units. Then this is 10 to the power minus 4, 10 to the power minus 3, power minus 2, 10 to the power minus 1, and say 1. Okay, so I'll just draw this dolomite, then the more is limestone. Limestone is calcium carbonate, huh? And dolomite is CaMG. This is dolomite, and this is limestone. Okay, and then sandstone. Sandstone has a wider susceptibility range. Sandstone, shell, and then granite, gabbro, basalt. Granite, gabbro, basalt. So you can see the igneous rocks. Yeah, the igneous rocks are generally having a higher susceptibility value. Okay, considerably higher susceptibility value, simply because the igneous rocks generally contain ferromagnetic minerals. Okay, sandstone can also contain ferromagnetic mineral, but that is a little bit of a lesser percentage. Okay, so in general, the igneous rocks have a higher susceptibility value. Okay, now you can also do that exercise with respect to minerals. If I look at some of the common rock forming minerals, okay, so this is zero susceptibility. I'll just name the minerals and put the scales in a moment. This is K also in SI units. Okay. Now, if I tell you that one of them is quartz, yeah, which one do you think will be quartz? Can someone tell me which one do you think is quartz? Which one do you think is quartz? Just tell me one person. Or which two or three could be quartz?
Sir, the first or the second one?
The first or the second one. Why? Because quartz is diamagnetic, right? So it has a negative susceptibility value, right? So that is right. So say this is if it is quartz, it has a susceptibility value of minus 1.5 into 10 to the power minus 5. Yeah. Then calcite. Calcite is also diamagnetic in room temperature. Remember, 4 into 10 to the power minus 5. Pyrite is 0.0015. This is pyrite. This is hematite. We will talk about hematite, magnetite with more details. Okay. Hematite has a susceptibility of 0.0065. Then this is pyrrhotite. This is 1.5. And this is magnetite. Around 6. Okay. So you can see the presence of pyrrhotite or magnetite or hematite will really enhance the bulk susceptibility of a rock. So if they are present like 1 to 2% in a rock, that is good enough to actually make the whole rock behave as a ferromagnetic assemblage. Okay. So the diamagnetic and the paramagnetic components are kind of masked by the presence of the ferromagnetic minerals. Okay. Now, there is a very famous ternary diagram that you have to remember by yourself, because this defines most of the ferromagnetic oxides that we find in nature. Okay, ferromagnetic oxides. I don't know if you have read this diagram as yet, but nevertheless, I will take you through. But tell me something. Have you read about solid solution? Was solid solution taught to you in your mineralogy or introduction to earth science classes? Solid solution. Can someone tell me? No, sir. Yes, sir. Which one should I? Rahul, you seem to know about solid solution. How about Yash and Kevin? You don't know. How is that possible?
Sir, hello.
Yeah. Yes,
Sir,
Rahul.
Viladkar sir just taught it like a month ago.
Yeah. So then, why Kevin and Yash doesn't know about it? Do not know about it. Why Kevin? Why don't you know?
Sir, I'm not in that course.
You are not in that course. You are not earth science major.
No, sir.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'll then briefly talk about it. Okay, Yash, you did not hear him. Okay, solid solution for earth scientists. Solid solution is a very important fundamental aspect of mineralogy. Okay. If you don't know about it, Yash, you must know about it. Okay. It's absolutely important. Okay. So as the name suggests, solid solution. I will not give a very detailed explanation like Viladkar sir must have given you, but I'll take you through briefly what it is. Okay. Let me just use this ternary diagram to explain what it is. Okay, let's not take another example. So at the let me just draw it first, and then I'll explain what I'm drawing. I'll just explain what I'm trying to. Okay. Now, what is solid solution? Solid solution is actually a process of cation exchange, mostly cation exchange. Okay, by means of which you actually, generate a series of minerals. Okay. Now, if you take the example of if you take the example of, for example, woostite and hematite, okay, you can see that if you mix the two 50%, you actually is creating Fe3O4, which is my magnetite. Similarly, you can see that magnetite and wolfspinel, okay, which is Fe2TiO4. Okay, what is happening? So Fe3O4, which is magnetite, and Fe2TiO4, which is wolfspinel. Okay, I am actually creating a series of minerals. So all these minerals are actually possible in this series. Okay, anywhere, depending on different fraction of. So the third cation site is being exchanged by Ti. Okay, so it can be completely exchanged, it can be partially exchanged, and so on and so forth. So I can essentially create a whole mineral series by exchanging the cation site, by exchanging the element in the cation site. Okay, so this is called ulvospinel magnetite solid solution series. Okay, this is called ilmenohematite. So this is ilmenite. FeTiO3 is ilmenite, and this is hematite. Ilmenohematite solid solution series. This is ilmenoroutile pseudobrookite solid solution series. Okay, and then this is rutile oostite solid solution series. This is oostite hematite solid solution series. This is rutile hematite solid solution series. Okay, so just by exchanging the cation site, just by exchanging the cation, in this particular case, Ti, which is Ti and iron, okay, by exchanging these two minerals or having different fraction of these two elements in the cation site, I can create, a series of minerals which forms the major oxide groups of the common rock forming minerals. Okay, and that can have slightly different susceptibility values and Curie temperatures. Okay, so say for example, the magnetite ulvospinel series. If I if I have complete replacement of Ti in one cation site, I'm creating from magnetite ulvospinel, right? So this Ti might not be 100% replaced. This could be, uh, Fe2 Ti could be, half replaced or four. I don't know. You can figure out the formula properly. But then the moral of the story is, by substituting the third iron in the cation site with titanium at different fraction, I can change two things. One is, of course, the bulk susceptibility value and the Curie temperature. Okay, slightly different. But then ulvospinel and magnetite has like similar type of uh, um, susceptibility and uh, Curie temperature. But then by changing the titanium, you can slightly modify it. Okay, so is true for ilmenite and hematite. So this is same. Hence, it is called ilmenohematite series. Okay, and they are all solid solution because this cation exchange happens not in the liquid state. It happens in the solid state itself. Okay, this happens in the solid state itself. The process of cation exchange that creates a series of minerals, and this particular series is very important for magnetic mineralogy, to understand the magnetic mineralogy, because they are ferromagnetic, and the presence of any of them in the minerals actually change the bulk susceptibility of the rock to a higher value. 1 or 2% of the presence of magnetite can actually. So if I am looking at a sandstone which is 99% quartz, let's look at a sandstone which is 99% quartz. Okay, let's just over here. Okay, so I'm looking at a sandstone which is SiO2, right? In general, it is what sort of if I look at the bulk susceptibility, what bulk susceptibility the sandstone will give? Okay, what type of bulk susceptibility will it give? Can someone tell me?
Negative.
Negative, right? So it will behave as a diamagnetic mineral, diamagnetic rock. Okay, but then if I have maybe 2% of magnetite into it, okay, this diamagnetic behavior will be completely masked. Okay, the whole bulk susceptibility will rise up, and then it will act as a ferromagnetic. ferromagnetic rock, simply because of some of the some percentage of ferromagnetic minerals are there. So these are all ferromagnetic minerals, okay, at the room temperature, and the presence of them in any rock actually changes the bulk susceptibility to a very drastically actually. Okay. Now I have to tell you about,
Excuse me, sir.
yeah.
एक second, huh?
हाँ
So,
बोलिए बोलिए.
if we're talking about this magnetite olivospheric series, okay?
हाँ.
So, like, how many minerals are there in between these two minerals?
As I mean, as many as you want actually.
As many as you want. ऐसे मतलब,
As many as you can actually create in nature, no problem. I mean, it's anything is possible in between.
so like they're not particularly named.
No. Hence, they are called magnetite ulbospinel series. Actually, you
Okay.
cannot really. So you actually call them as titanomagnetite. Okay,
Titanium.
titanomagnetite.
So like there will be no midpoint of this series.
No. I mean, there will be a midpoint, of course, with a fixed formula, but then it's not the only formula that is possible. Anything in between is possible.
Okay.
Okay, it only depends on how much titanium is actually replacing the iron.
Okay, sir.
Okay, that's also whether it is completely devoid of titanium, then it is purely magnetite, and then if there are certain percentage of titanium in the crystal structure, then it is titanomagnetite. Okay, and if one of the iron is completely replaced by titanium, then we call it ulbospinel. Is that clear? But any percentage of titanium impurity is possible in magnetite. So that will change, that will shift the point from here to here to here to here. You know, can be
Yes.
anything. Hence, it is called solid solution.
Yes.
Okay, you must have, I mean, read a little bit about the solid solution series for feldspar, right? So you have calcium, sodium, and potassium. So KAlSi3. Let me just. I am not a mineralogist, you know, but I am a geologist, so I'll give it a try. You have to excuse me if I make a mistake, okay? But I'll still give it a try. So this is KAlSi3O8. This is potash feldspar, huh? Potassium feldspar. K feldspar we call it. Then this is Na. Al Si3O8. This is sodium feldspar. Okay. And then this is third end member is CaAl2Si2O8. I hope I have done the formula justice, but yeah, you can check it. And you have to excuse me if I make a little bit mistake here and there because I don't write them every time. This is called calcium feldspar. Okay. I just want to give you the flavor what happens. Now, this is what we call as the plagioclase solid solution series. Okay, this is plagioclase solid solution series, and this is, you know, the replacement between sodium and potassium. This is replacement between sodium and calcium. But remember, this doesn't exist, huh? There is no replacement between calcium and potassium. Okay, so that this particular arm of the triangle is not a solid solution series. So what happens here? There is replacement of calcium with sodium, okay, with different percentages. And then you can create different minerals at different places. Here, sodium is being replaced by potassium. So, you can get different minerals here. Let me see if I have written it rightly. Just a moment. And we can do the reality check by ourselves right now itself.
Yeah, sir, you have interchanged the potassium and calcium part.
Have interchanged potassium and calcium?
Yes, sir.
What do you mean?
Like calcium should be at top and
That's what I have
sorry,
done.
sorry. Potassium should be at top.
That doesn't matter.
Like
Come on. So there is a solid solution series between calcium and sodium, and there is
but
a solid solution series between sodium and potassium.
yeah, I know that. But like the Plagioclase solution series should be at bottom then, right?
No, plagioclase is calcium and sodium. Come on.
Like I don't remember that part, that's why I'm asking you.
Just a moment. Let me check. I'll just stop the presentation for a moment and then let me check. If I have made a mistake, okay, then I will treat you with chocolates when you are back. If I have done it correctly, then you will treat me with a chocolate. Is that a deal? Rahul,
Sir, I'm not the class representative. I
on.
cannot comment about that.
Where is your class representative? Yes, I am getting a chocolate. Adil is the class representative, right?
Yes, sir.
If I have done it correctly, then I get a chocolate, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If not, you all get a chocolate. So pray that I have done it wrongly.
Yes, sir.
You see, I have done it right. Calcium and sodium, CaAl2Si2O8, NaLSi3O8. So there is a solid solution series between calcium and sodium, and then there is a solid solution series between sodium and potassium. Okay, KaLSi3O8, NaLSi3O8. So there is no solid solution series between calcium and potassium. Okay, so so you can see here any composition is possible. So sodium feldspar is called albite. Then slightly replaced potassium anorthoclase, then sanidine, and then orthoclase, right? Orthoclase or microclean, whereas 100% potassium replacement. Similarly, oligoclase, andesine, labradorite, bitonite, and anorthite. 100% calcium is anorthite. Okay, so you can see any of the percentage of sodium and calcium is possible in here. Similarly, any percentage of sodium and potassium is possible in this solid solution. And this is what we call miscibility gap, because this calcium to sodium, that solid solution series is not present in nature. So now if you look at it with my diagram, you see I have done it right. I'm joking, you don't have to give me. Okay, is the solid solution now clear for you? I mean, at least what it means.
Sir, so will we use this diagram to like analyze at what point what will be the magnetic properties at each point of
Yes,
the series?
yes, absolutely. So
Okay.
what you essentially do, I mean, depending on its the amount of titanium, say for example in the Ulvospinel magnetite series, depending on the titanium, I mean the uh, Curie temperature and the bulk susceptibility will change slightly. Okay.
Okay. Right.
So now go back to the discussion. So for magnetite, yeah, which is Fe3O4, right? For magnetite, the MS is 4.8 into 10 to the power 5. So 4.8 into 10 to the power 5. What is MS? What was MS? MS is saturation magnetization. You remember? Where it gets saturated in the hysteresis curve. So this saturation magnetization, this is what we had called as MS. So that will be fixed for a particular mineral. Okay. And the Curie temperature will be 578 degree centigrade. Okay. Now this magnetic saturation and the Curie temperature and the bulk susceptibility, all these things will slightly change if I keep on replacing titanium into the structure. Okay. That's the moral of the story. Now, for hematite, I'll give you the example for magnetite and hematite. The rest is given in Lowry's book, a lot of detailed description. You can read them by yourself because it is not a very soothing thing to just write down points which are informative. So the Curie temperature for hematite is 675 degrees centigrade. Okay. And it has the MS for hematite is 2.2 into 10 to the power P. Right. So you can see 675 degrees centigrade. So there is I'll just finish the class with one particular explanation. So for hematite, after 675 degrees centigrade, okay, it starts acting as a paramagnetic mineral. And below minus 23 degrees centigrade, it actually acts as a ferrimagnetic mineral. Between minus 23 degrees centigrade to 675 degrees centigrade, it acts as a ferromagnetic mineral. Okay, that's for hematite. Now, but the saturation magnetization is quite low for quite high for hematite. Okay, it's feebly magnetic. The susceptibility value is also lower than magnetite. Now, just one thing I want to talk about, and then I'll stop. That is called KT test, or temperature versus susceptibility test. Okay. So what you essentially do that you take a bit of sample, okay, and then you keep on heating that particular uh, sample, okay. So and then so here I plot temperature, and then here I plot bulk susceptibility Km, okay. So what I observe that the say for example I go like this, have a quite constant Km, and say for example at 578 degrees centigrade, where this is 578 degrees centigrade, I see there is a sharp drop in my susceptibility. Okay. I see a sharp drop in my susceptibility, and the susceptibility continues like this. Okay, so I'm hitting the sample, and I'm seeing this sort of behavior in the susceptibility value. Okay, these curves are generally called KT curves, or temperature dependent susceptibility curves. Okay, so if such sharp drop happens at 578 degrees centigrade, I say that the particular rock or the sample has magnetite. Okay, because at the Curie temperature it has, I mean, it's no more behaving as a magnetite. Okay, after the Curie temperature, its magnetization is lost. Now, if I change the value of titanium, if it is in the titanium magnetite series anywhere, what I will observe, I might observe this Curie temperature at 570, okay, or maybe here. Okay, so this will be this whole range will be represented by my titanium magnetite series. Maybe I'm keep on hitting it, and then I see at 675 degrees centigrade, I see another drop. Okay, so that means the sample also contains hematite. Okay, the sample also contains hematite. But if I see only the jump at 675 degrees centigrade, then I will know that the sample only contains hematite. It doesn't contain magnetite. Okay, and then of course, depending on the replacement of titanium, or any other mineral, I mean, between iron and titanium, this there will be a range in value that will represent the series, either it is ilmenohematite series or titanomagnetite series. Okay, so the Curie temperature is pretty characteristic in find out the magnetic mineralogy by doing a temperature dependent susceptibility test. Okay, is that clear? Now, if you have a question, I'm happy to answer. Any question? Okay. If not, then I will stop the class here. I'll upload a pre-recorded video on Friday, and I'll see you on see you in next week again. Thank you.